The flames of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the vast Wyoming skies in hues of amber and gold, as Sophia Oakley's trembling fingers clutched the weathered letter. Tears blurred the faded ink, her heart breaking anew with each familiar word. 3 years she'd waited, 3 years of empty promises from a man who'd never returned from Boston to the untamed frontier she called home. Behind her, the sound of spurs jingling against wooden floorboards broke the silence of her small homestead cabin. A shadow fell across the page as Thomas Garrison leaned against the doorframe, his tall frame silhouetted against the morning light. His eyes, the color of the endless prairie skies, watched her with a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior. "You're reading it again," he said, not a question but a quiet observation. The experienced ranch foreman removed his hat, revealing sun-streaked brown hair as he stepped further into the modest cabin. Sophia folded the letter, her fingers lingering over the creases worn thin from countless readings. "It's all I have left of him," she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, they rang hollow. Thomas moved closer, his movements deliberate and unhurried as he always was with spooked horses and wounded creatures. "James Harrington ain't coming back from Boston, Sophia. Been 3 years. Man promised you the moon but couldn't deliver a pebble." "I know," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the pine trees surrounding her homestead. She couldn't finish. Thomas reached out, calloused fingers brushing against her hand. "I watched you read that letter 100 times. Watched you wither a little more with each reading." His voice grew softer. "Some promises ain't worth the paper they're written on." A single tear escaped down Sophia's cheek as she stared at the letter. "Then, what am I supposed to hold on to?" Thomas stepped toward the fireplace where embers still glowed from the morning fire. He gestured to the dying flames. "She read her letter one last time," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The cowboy said, 'Burn it, I'll write you better ones.'" Sophia looked up, startled by both his words and the intensity in his gaze. For the first time in years, she truly saw the man who had been by her side through drought and blizzard, who had helped mend her fences and chase off wolves, who brought supplies when the winter snows made the journey to town impossible. "What are you saying, Thomas?" she asked, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "I'm saying I've loved you since the first moment you stepped off that stagecoach in '74. 3 years, Sophia. I've watched you wait for a ghost while I stood solid before you." He took a breath, steadying himself. "I ain't good with fancy words like your Boston man, but every promise I make, I keep." With trembling fingers, Sophia unfolded the letter one final time, eyes scanning the elegant script filled with excuses and delays. Then, with a decisive movement, she stepped forward and dropped the paper into the flames. They licked hungrily at the edges, consuming James's empty promises in seconds. "Then write me better ones," she whispered, turning to face Thomas fully. The year was 1877, and in the Wyoming Territory, where the law of the land was still being written, Sophia Oakley and Thomas Garrison were about to write their own story, one far more faithful than any letter could contain. The weeks that followed seemed to breathe new life into Sophia's small homestead. The aspens quivered with golden leaves, the September air crisp with the promise of coming autumn, as Thomas rode up the narrow dirt path to her cabin. True to his word, a folded piece of paper rested in his shirt pocket, the first of his promised letters. "I ain't much for penmanship," he apologized, handing over the carefully folded paper as they sat on her porch swing. The setting sun cast long shadows across her small vegetable garden where late-season tomatoes still ripened on the vine. Sophia unfolded it carefully, her eyes widening at the simple, heartfelt words. Unlike James's flowery prose and empty sentiments, Thomas's letter was direct, honest, and real. He wrote of the changing seasons, of the Mustang he was breaking for her to ride, and of his admiration for her strength. The last line, written with particular care, read, "I promise to show up, every time, Thomas. No one's ever called me strong before, she said softly, looking up at him with wonder. Then no one's been paying proper attention, he replied, his weathered face softening as he reached for her hand. That evening, they walked the boundaries of her homestead, Thomas pointing out where the fence needed mending before winter and where the spring creek might overflow during the thaw. His knowledge of the land was intimate, respectful. He spoke of it not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. "How did you learn all this?" Sophia asked as they paused by the creek, watching the water tumble over smooth stones. "Spent 2 years with the Shoshone after the war," he explained, skipping a flat stone across the water's surface. "They taught me to read the land better than any book could." "The war," Sophia echoed softly. Though Thomas rarely mentioned his time fighting in the Civil War, the shadow that crossed his face told stories his lips wouldn't form. "You never speak of it." "Some memories best left buried," he said simply, then nodded toward a hawk circling overhead. "Like that bird, better to keep looking forward than down." As September faded into October, Thomas's visits became more frequent. Each time he arrived, he brought not only supplies or help with chores, but also another letter. Some were short, barely a paragraph. Others filled an entire page with observations about the stars, the changing weather, or memories from his childhood in Missouri. Each one ended with a simple promise, different each time but equally sincere. One evening, as they finished repairing her chicken coop, a sudden autumn downpour sent them rushing into the cabin, laughing and breathless. Sophia's hair, normally pinned in a practical bun, had come loose in the rain, falling in damp waves around her shoulders. Thomas stood mesmerized in her doorway, rainwater dripping from his hat brim. "You look like a painting," he said simply, the unexpected poetry of his observation making her cheeks flush warm. "You're dripping all over my floor," she countered, but her smile betrayed her. She handed him a towel, her fingers brushing against his with deliberate slowness. That night, as thunder rolled across the vast Wyoming sky, Thomas told her about his dreams of expanding his small ranch, of the apple orchard he'd started with saplings brought all the way from Missouri. "Land needs more than cattle," he explained. "Needs beauty too, like poetry and paintings." She teased gently, remembering his earlier words. His eyes met hers across the table. "Exactly like that." As October's brilliant colors faded into November's gray, Sophia found herself watching the horizon each afternoon, her heart quickening at the sight of a rider approaching. The letters now numbered 12, carefully stored in a wooden box where once James's single letter had lived. Thomas's words, though simpler and fewer than her former fiancé's, held substance and truth that made them weightier in her hands. One morning, while Thomas split firewood for her winter supply, Sophia found herself studying him from the kitchen window. The easy strength in his shoulders, the care with which he stacked the wood just as she preferred higher on the left to block the north wind. He anticipated needs she hadn't voiced, noticed details others overlooked. Later, as they shared coffee on the porch despite the biting cold, Thomas handed her another letter. This one was different, written on better paper, the words more carefully formed. "Been practicing my penmanship," he admitted with a hint of embarrassment. Sophia read it slowly, savoring each word. In this letter, he wrote of the coming winter and his concerns about her isolation. Then, with simple directness, he asked if she would consider spending the harshest months at his ranch where he could ensure her safety. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Finch would be proper company," he added hastily as she looked up from the page. "You'd have the guest room, He gestured to the vast emptiness surrounding her homestead. "Don't like thinking of you out here alone when the blizzards hit." Sophia studied his face, noting the worry etched around his eyes. "Are you asking as my friend, Thomas, or as something else?" "Both," he admitted, his honesty as direct as always. "I care too much to see you risk yourself out here, but I also—" He paused, gathering courage like a man about to ford a dangerous river. I also want more time with you, more evenings like this. The November wind whispered through the pines as Sophia considered his words. James had spoken of love within days of meeting her, his declarations as quick and showy as summer lightning. Thomas, by contrast, had built his case slowly, through actions rather than words, through presence rather than promises. "I'll come," she decided, watching relief flood his features. "But Thomas—" "Yes, I expect more letters, even under the same roof." His smile then was worth every heartache that had led her to this moment. The first snowfall came early that year, blanketing the land in white before Thanksgiving. Thomas arrived with his wagon to help Sophia temporarily close up her homestead, his horses sturdy and sure-footed in the deepening snow. "Will take us about 4 hours to reach my place," he explained as they loaded her trunks and secured her chickens in special crates. "Got the wagon fitted with extra blankets and hot bricks for your feet." The journey through the snow-covered landscape was like traveling through a dream. Towering pines heavy with white, open meadows sparkling under the winter sun, and distant mountains standing sentinel against the vast blue sky. Thomas pointed out landmarks as they traveled, telling her stories of each place where he'd found an abandoned eagle's nest, where the elk crossed during migration, where wildflowers would carpet the ground come spring. "You love this land," Sophia observed, watching his face animate as he described a hidden waterfall they would pass in the distance. "Man needs something to believe in," he replied simply. "For some it's God, for others gold. For me, it's this." He gestured to the wild beauty surrounding them. "Can't own it, not really. Can only be part of it for a while." His ranch came into view just as the winter sun began its early descent. Unlike many of the hastily constructed properties in the territory, Thomas's home spoke of permanence and care. The main house, built of solid logs and river stone, stood 2 stories tall with glass windows, a rarity and expense that surprised Sophia. A large barn, bunkhouse, and several outbuildings formed a protected courtyard, while corrals and pastures stretched beyond. And there, on a south-facing slope, stood rows of young apple trees, carefully fenced to protect them from deer and elk. "Thomas," she breathed, taking in the unexpected beauty of the place. "You never said." "Ain't one for boasting," he replied, though pleasure at her reaction was evident in his voice. "Built most of it myself with help from my ranch hands. Been working on it 8 years now. Mrs. Finch, a cheerful widow in her 60s, welcomed them at the door, already fussing about the cold and how thin Sophia looked. "Been cooking since sunrise," she announced, ushering them inside. "Figure a body needs proper feeding after a journey through this weather." The interior of Thomas's home reflected the same care as its exterior. Simple but beautiful furniture, much of it clearly handcrafted, filled rooms warmed by stone fireplaces. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that surprised Sophia with their variety. Books on agriculture and animal husbandry stood alongside poetry collections and history tomes. "You read poetry?" she asked, running her fingers along leather spines as Thomas brought in the last of her trunks. He looked almost embarrassed. "Man can't work all the time. Winter nights get long." That evening, after a meal that confirmed Mrs. Finch's culinary talents, Sophia found another letter waiting on the bedside table in her room. This one spoke not of promises, but of gratitude for her trust in coming to his home, for the light she brought to his days, for the future possibilities that stretched before them like the unexplored territory beyond his lands. As winter settled fully upon the Wyoming Territory, Sophia discovered a rhythm to life at the Garrison Ranch. Mornings began early, with Thomas often gone before dawn to work with his men and cattle. Mrs. Finch's breakfast table became a gathering place where ranch hands reported conditions and plans were made for the day. Sophia, initially feeling like a guest, soon found herself an integral part of these discussions, her practical suggestions and observations welcomed and implemented. Never seen the boss smile so much, Hank, Thomas's foreman, commented one morning after she'd suggested a more efficient way to rotate the winter feed. Man used to be serious as a judge. Still is serious, argued Pete, the youngest hand at barely 20. Just serious with a side of happy now. The afternoons, when weather permitted, often found Sophia exploring the ranch with Thomas. He showed her the spring that never froze, the cave where a mountain lion had raised cubs the previous year, the ridge where wildflowers would bloom first when winter retreated. During heavy snows, they stayed closer to home, with Thomas teaching her chess before the fire or reading aloud from his collection while she mended or knitted. The letters continued, appearing in unexpected places tucked into her coat pocket before a ride, beneath her breakfast plate, or slipped under her door at night. Each revealed another layer of Thomas's thoughts, hopes, and increasingly, his feelings. Christmas approached with a flurry of preparations. Mrs. Finch baked for days, filling the house with the scents of ginger and cinnamon. Thomas disappeared into his workshop for hours, emerging with sawdust in his hair but refusing to reveal his project. On Christmas Eve, with a blizzard howling outside, the entire ranch gathered in the main house. The ranch hands, cleaned up and awkward in their Sunday best, brought homemade gifts and stories to share. Mexican Carlos taught them songs from his homeland, while old Jim, who'd been a fiddler in his youth, played tunes that soon had everyone's feet tapping. Later, when the hands had returned to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Finch had retired, Thomas led Sophia to the Christmas tree, a small pine decorated with carved wooden ornaments and candles. "Got something for you," he said, retrieving a package from beneath the tree. Inside, Sophia found a beautifully crafted wooden box with her initials inlaid in darker wood on the lid. When opened, it played a gentle melody she recognized from one of their evenings by the fire. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Open the drawer," Thomas urged, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. A small drawer at the bottom of the box revealed a letter different from all the others, written on fine parchment, sealed with wax impressed with a G. "Wanted to do this proper," he explained as she broke the seal. The letter inside wasn't long, but its contents made Sophia's heart race. Thomas wrote of his growing love, of the joy she brought to his days, and of his hopes for their future. The final paragraph posed a question, not an outright proposal, but a request to court her officially with marriage in mind. "I know it's been less than 3 months since you burned his letter," Thomas said quietly. "Not asking for immediate answers, just wanted you to know where my heart stands." Sophia looked up at him, this man who had taught her what real devotion looked like, not through grand gestures or flowery words, but through steady presence and actions that matched his promises. "Yes," she said simply, watching his eyes widen in surprise. "Yes to courting, yes to seeing where this leads us." His smile then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, warm, and full of promise. The new year of 1878 arrived with celebrations at the ranch and a sense of possibility that Sophia hadn't felt in years. January brought frigid temperatures that kept everyone close to hearth and home, but February saw a thaw that allowed for more movement across the snow-packed land. It was during this thaw that the first trouble arrived. Thomas returned from a trip to town with a tight expression that immediately put Sophia on alert. "What is it?" she asked as he removed his snow-covered coat in the entryway. "Ryder came through with news," he said, his voice deliberately casual though tension lined his shoulders. "Train from Boston arrived in Cheyenne yesterday. Passenger list included a James Harrington." Sophia felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "James is here." "In Wyoming Territory," Thomas nodded, his eyes carefully watching her reaction. "According to the gossip, he's been telling folks he's come to claim his fiancée." A strange calm settled over Sophia as she processed this information. 3 months ago, such news would have sent her heart racing with confused emotions. Now, she felt only annoyance at the intrusion. "He's 3 years too late," she stated firmly, "and I am not his fiancée." Relief visibly washed over Thomas's features. "Man's got some nerve," he muttered, then squared his shoulders. "If he comes this way, if he comes this way," Sophia interrupted, stepping closer to take Thomas's weathered hands in hers, "I will tell him myself that my heart has found its true home." Thomas's expression softened as he drew her closer. "Been waiting to hear those words," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Their first kiss, shared in that moment with snow melting from Thomas's boots and the scent of pine from his journey still clinging to his clothes, was everything Sophia had never known to hope for, honest, tender, and filled with promise. 2 days later, as Sophia helped Mrs. Finch inventory the root cellar, a commotion outside drew their attention. Through the kitchen window, they watched a sleek black horse and cutter slide into the ranch yard, the driver dressed in city clothes clearly unsuited for Wyoming's winter. "Lord above, Mrs. Finch muttered, wiping her hands on her apron. "That'll be him then." Sophia smoothed her simple woolen dress, suddenly conscious of its practical plainness compared to the fashionable clothes she'd once worn in St. Louis before coming west. But as she watched James climb from the cutter, wobbling slightly on leather-soled boots ill-equipped for ice, she felt no insecurity, only certainty about where she belonged. "I'll speak with him," she told Mrs. Finch, who nodded approvingly. "Want me to fetch the shotgun?" The older woman offered, only half joking. "I don't think that will be necessary," Sophia smiled, though she appreciated the protective sentiment. James Harrington looked both the same and utterly different from her memories. Still handsome in the conventional way that had once made her heart flutter, he now seemed somehow less substantial against the backdrop of Wyoming's rugged landscape. His fashionable coat, while expensive, appeared flimsy against the elements. His cleanly shaven face, once considered the mark of a refined gentleman, now struck her as boyish compared to Thomas's weathered features. "Sophia," he called, his voice carrying across the yard as she stepped onto the porch. "My darling, I've found you at last." She remained on the porch, making no move to descend the steps as he approached. "Hello, James, this is unexpected." His confident smile faltered at her cool greeting. "Unexpected, but surely you received my letters explaining the unfortunate delays." "Letter," she corrected. "Singular." "1 letter in 3 years, James." He waved this away as though it were a trivial detail. "The mails in this territory are notoriously unreliable. I sent dozens." He climbed the steps, reaching for her hands which she deliberately kept clasped before her. "But I'm here now, just as I promised. Ready to take you back to civilization." The presumption in his words might once have gone unnoticed. Now it grated like sand in a wound. "This is civilization, James. Different from Boston, certainly, but civilized in ways that matter deeply to me." Confusion crossed his handsome features. "Surely you jest, living in this wilderness so far from culture and society." He glanced around at the well-built ranch with something like disdain. "Whose property is this? Are you employed as a governess?" The sound of horses approaching interrupted her response. Thomas rode into the yard with Hank and 2 other ranch hands, all of them clearly having ridden hard from the pastures at the news of a visitor. Thomas dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to Hank before approaching the porch. His expression was composed, but Sophia recognized the alertness in his stance. "Everything all right here?" he asked, his eyes meeting Sophia's first before acknowledging James with a neutral nod. "Thomas," Sophia said, warmth infusing her voice. "This is James Harrington from Boston." "James, this is Thomas Garrison, the owner of this ranch." James extended his hand with the automatic politeness of his upbringing, though his expression had grown wary. "A pleasure. I'm an old friend of Miss Oakley's." "Mr. Harrington," Thomas returned evenly, his handshake brief but proper. "Miss Oakley mentioned you once wrote her a letter." The emphasis on the singular was subtle but unmistakable. James's smile tightened. "There seems to be some confusion about correspondence. perfectly understandable given the primitive postal service out here. He turned back to Sophia, his tone becoming more intimate. "We have much to discuss, my dear. Perhaps somewhere private." Before Sophia could respond, the ranch house door opened and Mrs. Finch emerged with a tray. "Thought you might want coffee," she announced, her shrewd eyes taking in the tableau. "Cold day for traveling." "Thank you, Mrs. Finch," Sophia said gratefully, using the interruption to step back from James. "We can talk in the parlor." The next hour was among the most uncomfortable of Sophia's life, yet also the most clarifying. Seated in Thomas's well-appointed parlor, James spun elaborate tales of business dealings that had prevented his return, of letters lost in transit, of his undying devotion despite the separation. With each embellishment, each carefully constructed excuse, Sophia saw more clearly what she had been blind to before: the hollow center of his promises, the self-interest behind his charm. Thomas remained present but largely silent, standing near the fireplace while James held forth from his seat across from Sophia. Only someone who knew him well would recognize the tension in his posture, the careful restraint he exercised as James repeatedly referred to our future together and your return east. Finally, when James paused for breath, Sophia spoke. "I'm not returning to Boston, James. My life is here now." He blinked, genuinely surprised by her directness. "Don't be hasty, my dear. I understand you've had to make accommodations to survive out here, but that's all over now. I've come to rescue you from all this." He gestured vaguely at the comfortable room with its hand-hewn furniture and colorful Navajo rugs. "I don't need rescuing," Sophia stated firmly. "I've built a life here that fulfills me." And she glanced at Thomas, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I've found someone who keeps his promises." James's expression darkened as the implication of her words registered. He looked between Sophia and Thomas, understanding dawning slowly. "You can't be serious. This frontier man." "This, Cowboy," the last word dripped with disdain. Thomas shifted slightly, but his voice remained level when he spoke. "Mr. Harrington seems to me a man who abandons a woman for 3 years has surrendered any claim to her affections." "Abandoned," James shot to his feet. "I was securing our future, building connections that would benefit us both." He turned to Sophia, his tone becoming wheedling. "The time simply got away from me, darling. Surely you understand." "I understand completely," Sophia replied, rising to stand beside Thomas. "Time reveals truth, James. Your absence spoke volumes that your words can't erase." James's handsome face contorted with disbelief and growing anger. "So you've thrown yourself away on the first man who showed interest. A rancher in the middle of nowhere." Thomas stepped forward then, his patience visibly fraying. "Think carefully about your next words, Mr. Harrington. You're a guest in my home, but that courtesy has limits." For a moment, it seemed James might escalate the confrontation. Then, with visible effort, he composed himself. "I see I've arrived too late. A temporary situation, I'm sure, once you've had time to reconsider." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "I'll be staying in Laramie for a fortnight. When you change your mind, send word." He placed the envelope on the table before turning to leave. At the door, he paused to look back at Sophia. 3 years is nothing compared to a lifetime of regret, my dear." After the front door closed behind him, silence filled the parlor. Thomas and Sophia stood side by side, listening to the sounds of James's cutter departing. "You all right?" Thomas asked quietly. Sophia looked down at the envelope on the table. Another letter, another collection of James's empty words. With deliberate movements, she picked it up and walked to the fireplace. "I already burned the important letter," she said, dropping James's unopened message into the flames. "These words don't matter anymore." Thomas moved closer, relief evident in his features. "Meant what I said about writing you better ones." Sophia turned to him with a smile that contained both certainty and promise. "You already have." That evening, after the ranch had settled into its nighttime routines, Thomas found Sophia in the small library adjoining the parlor. She sat by the fire, a book open in her lap though her gaze was directed at the dancing flames. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. "I was thinking about choices," she replied, closing the book. "How different my life would be if I'd kept waiting for James, if I hadn't burned that letter." Thomas was quiet for a moment, watching the firelight play across her features. "Wasn't just about burning a letter," he finally said. "Was about choosing to see what was real instead of chasing ghosts." Sophia nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I almost missed you, Thomas, almost missed this life because I was looking backward. But you didn't," he pointed out, reaching for her hand. "You looked forward instead." Their conversation drifted to plans for spring repairs to her homestead, crops to plant, a new mare Thomas thought would suit her riding style. The easy way they discussed these shared futures erased any lingering shadows James's visit might have cast. Later, as Thomas walked Sophia to her bedroom door, he handed her another letter. "Wrote this before Harrington showed up," he explained. "Still holds true." Alone in her room, Sophia opened it to find a different kind of letter than his previous ones. This one contained a story of a man who had watched a woman step off a stagecoach and felt his world shift on its axis, of the patience it had taken to wait while she healed from old wounds, of the joy he found in her strength and spirit. The final paragraph read, "Spring's coming, Sophia. Been thinking we might plant some of those apple saplings near your homestead. Trees need years to mature, and I'm planning on spending a lot of years watching over both you and those trees. If you'll have me." The simple proposal, so characteristically Thomas in its straightforward honesty, brought tears to her eyes. Unlike James's dramatic promises of rescue and luxury, Thomas offered partnership, roots, and a future they would build together. She slept that night with the letter beneath her pillow, dreaming of apple blossoms and promises kept. The remainder of winter passed in a rhythm of work and closeness that deepened the bonds between them. Thomas formally asked for Sophia's hand over a dinner. He insisted on cooking himself a surprisingly accomplished meal that revealed yet another hidden talent. "Man who can't feed himself has no business being in the wilderness," he explained as he served a venison stew that rivaled Mrs. Finch's best efforts. They agreed to marry in June, when Sophia's homestead would be blooming with the wildflowers she'd planted along the path to her cabin. The early spring of 1878 saw them dividing time between the ranch and her smaller property, preparing both for the seasons ahead. True to his word, Thomas brought apple saplings to plant along the southern exposure of her land. "Won't bear fruit for at least 5 years," he explained as they worked the soil together. "But that's the thing about apples, plant them for the future, not just for yourself." As March surrendered to April, the landscape transformed from winter's white to the first tentative greens of spring. Calving season kept Thomas and his men busy day and night, while Sophia split her time between helping with the new livestock and preparing her own garden beds. It was during one of these busy days that a rider approached Sophia's homestead, where she worked alone, Thomas having returned to the ranch to help with a difficult birth. At first, she assumed it was one of the ranch hands with a message, but as the rider drew closer, she recognized James Harrington's straight-backed posture. Setting down her garden tools, Sophia steeled herself for another confrontation. 2 months had passed since his visit to the ranch, and she had heard nothing from him, a relief she'd thought meant he had finally accepted her decision and returned east. "James," she greeted him coolly as he dismounted, noting that he'd at least acquired more suitable riding attire for the territory. "I thought you'd return to Boston and leave without you," he replied with forced lightness. "I've been making arrangements, getting to know the territory." He glanced around her modest homestead with poorly disguised disdain. "I can see why you might be tempted by Garrison's more substantial property, but I have exciting news that changes everything." Sophia crossed her arms, already weary of his presumptions. "Nothing has changed, James. I'm engaged to Thomas. We're to be married in June." If he registered her words, he gave no indication. Instead, he withdrew a folded document from his jacket. I've acquired land rights to develop a new township along the coming railroad extension. Prime location, Sophia. We'll build a proper house, nothing like these crude structures. You'll be the first lady of Harrington, Wyoming. The grandiosity of his vision might once have impressed her. Now, it only highlighted the fundamental differences between James's ambitions and the life she had chosen. That doesn't interest me, his confident smile faltered. Doesn't interest you? Sophia, I'm offering you a chance to help civilize this wilderness, to build something lasting and important. This isn't wilderness to me, James, it's home. She gestured to the budding garden, the newly planted apple saplings, the small but solid cabin. What Thomas and I are building is lasting and important to us. Frustration crossed James's handsome features. You can't seriously prefer this. This primitive existence with that man to the opportunities I'm offering. That man, Sophia said evenly, has shown me more genuine care in months than you did in years of courtship. He doesn't see Wyoming as something to be civilized or exploited. He sees it as something to be respected and tended. James's expression hardened. I see what's happened. You've been alone too long, desperate for attention. Garrison took advantage of your vulnerability. The accusation was so far from truth that Sophia nearly laughed. Thomas waited patiently for me to heal from your abandonment. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply proved day after day that his word could be trusted. She stepped closer, her voice firm. I am not vulnerable or desperate, James. I am making a clear-eyed choice about the man and the life I want. For a moment, genuine hurt flashed across his face, quickly replaced by cold anger. You'll regret this. When winter comes again and you're trapped in this God-forsaken place, you'll remember what you threw away. The only thing I regret, Sophia replied steadily, is how long I spent waiting for you instead of recognizing what was right before me. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Thomas rode into view, his expression concerned as he took in the scene before him. Everything all right here, he called, dismounting with fluid grace that contrasted sharply with James's more awkward movements. Mr. Harrington was just leaving, Sophia replied, moving to stand beside Thomas as he joined them. He has a township to build. Thomas's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing, merely nodding to James with the same neutral courtesy he'd shown at their first meeting. James looked between them, taking in their united front and easy closeness. Something in his expression shifted a reluctant recognition, perhaps, that he had truly lost. I wish you joy of your choice, Sophia, he said stiffly, though his tone conveyed the opposite. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode away, his rigid back conveying all the offense his words had restrained. They watched until he disappeared over the ridge, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. Thought he'd gone back east, Thomas finally commented. Apparently he's planning to build a town called Harrington, Sophia replied, unable to keep a note of incredulity from her voice. Along the railroad extension. Thomas snorted softly. Man doesn't know the plans changed last month. Railroad's going 15 miles south of where he thinks. Sophia looked up at him in surprise. How do you know that? Been investing in this territory 8 years, he replied simply. Pay attention to what matters. His arm slipped around her waist. Speaking of which, got another letter for you. The remainder of spring passed in a flurry of activity, as preparations for both the wedding and the summer season occupied every waking hour. Sophia divided her time between her homestead and Thomas's ranch, learning the rhythms and responsibilities of the larger operation while maintaining her own smaller property. Don't have to keep both places, Thomas pointed out as they rode between the properties one May afternoon. Could sell your claim, use the money to expand the orchard, or build that greenhouse you've been wanting. Sophia considered this as they crested a hill that offered views of both homesteads, her small cabin nestled among young trees to the east, his sprawling ranch with its established buildings to the west. I'd like to keep it, she decided. Not to live in separately, but as part of our shared holdings. The soil there is better for certain crops and, she smiled at a memory, it's where I burned his letter and found you instead. Thomas nodded, understanding the sentiment behind her practical reasoning. Could build a proper summer kitchen there, place to stay when working that side of our land. The casual way he referred to their properties as a single entity, already joined in his mind as they soon would be in law, warmed her heart. Unlike James, who had spoken of rescue and removal, Thomas naturally included her homestead and her desires in his vision of their future. By early June, news had spread through the scattered community about their upcoming wedding. Preparations took on a festive air as neighboring ranchers and townspeople planned to attend what would be one of the larger social gatherings of the season. Mrs. Finch oversaw the food preparations with military precision, while Thomas's ranch hands competed to present the most useful or beautiful handcrafted wedding gifts. 3 days before the wedding, as Sophia was making final adjustments to her wedding dress, a practical but pretty blue silk she'd ordered from Laramie, a letter arrived from an unexpected source. The careful handwriting on the envelope belonged to her younger sister Sarah, who had remained in St. Louis after their parents' deaths when Sophia had headed west. Inside was news that changed everything. Sarah was coming west, had already started the journey, and hoped to reach them in time for the wedding. Having recently lost her position as a teacher due to her employer's financial difficulties, she had decided to take Sophia's long-standing invitation to visit. "She's actually coming," Sophia told Thomas that evening, excitement and worry mingling in her voice. "But the timing, will she arrive in time? And where will she stay?" Thomas, practical as always, immediately began making arrangements. "Stage should get her to Laramie day after tomorrow if the schedule holds. I'll send Hank to meet every arrival until she's found." He smiled at Sophia's evident joy. "Got the blue room all ready for her at the ranch, been empty too long anyway." The day before the wedding dawned clear and warm. A perfect Wyoming June day, with wildflowers carpeting the meadows and gentle breezes carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. Thomas and his men had been up since before dawn, preparing Sophia's homestead for the ceremony and celebration. Tables made of planks and sawhorses were set up beneath the cottonwoods, decorated with wildflowers and ribbons under Mrs. Finch's direction. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was complete. The path to Sophia's cabin had been lined with lanterns for the evening, the newly built arch near the young apple trees decorated with early summer blooms, and space cleared for dancing under the stars. As Sophia surveyed these preparations with satisfaction, the sound of an approaching wagon caught her attention. Turning, she saw Hank driving the ranch wagon down the track, a young woman seated beside him. "Sarah," she called, hardly daring to believe her sister had arrived in time. The woman in the wagon stood, waving enthusiastically. "Sophia, oh my goodness, look at all this." The sisters' reunion was a cascade of tears, laughter, and overlapping conversation as they embraced for the first time in nearly 4 years. Though they had corresponded regularly, letters couldn't capture the changes time had wrought in both of them. Sarah, younger by 5 years, had grown from a girl of 17 into a composed young woman of 22, while Sophia knew her own time in Wyoming had added character to her once smooth features. "Let me look at you," Sophia said, holding her sister at arm's length. "You're so grown up." Sarah laughed, her blue eyes so like Sophia's bright with excitement. "And you're so capable looking, you even stand differently." It was true, Sophia realized. The uncertain young woman who had arrived in Wyoming Territory, seeking a new start after her parents' deaths, had been replaced by someone who knew her own strength, who had faced wilderness and heartbreak, and emerged more authentic than before. "Wait until you meet Thomas," she told Sarah, linking arms to lead her toward the cabin. "He's everything James wasn't: honest, steadfast, real. "I can't wait," Sarah replied, then lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Though I must admit, I'm equally excited to sleep in a real bed after 2 weeks of travel." The accommodations grew increasingly rustic the further west we came. That evening, a small gathering assembled at the ranch for the traditional dinner before the wedding day. Thomas's closest ranch hands joined them at the long dining table, along with Mrs. Finch, the minister and his wife from Laramie, and Sarah. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and stories that gave Sarah glimpses into the life her sister had built. "Never seen the boss actually lose a chess game before Miss Sophia came along," Hank told Sarah, grinning at Thomas's mock scowl. "She beat him 3 games straight that first winter." "Only because I was distracted," Thomas protested mildly. "By what?" Sophia challenged, eyes twinkling. "By whether you'd notice if I moved pieces while you weren't looking," he admitted, to general laughter. Later, as the evening wound down, Thomas found a moment alone with Sophia on the porch while the others continued their conversations inside. "Got something for you," he said, producing a letter from his pocket. "Last one before you become Mrs. Garrison." Sophia took it with a tender smile. "The most important one yet, just the latest," he corrected. "Plan to keep writing them long after tomorrow." Under the glow of the porch lantern, Sophia read words that spoke of futures and forevers, of the life they would build together, of Thomas's gratitude that she had chosen him. The final paragraph, written with particular care, touched her deeply. "Tomorrow I'll make promises before God and our friends. But know this, I've been keeping my promises to you since the day you burned that letter, and I'll keep them until my last breath. Every sunrise we share is another letter I'm writing to you with my life, instead of just my words." The morning of the wedding arrived with the soft golden light that made Wyoming summers magical. At Sophia's homestead, activity began at dawn as final preparations were made for the afternoon ceremony. Sarah helped her sister dress in the blue silk that complemented her eyes and arranged her hair with wildflowers instead of the traditional veil. "You look radiant," Sarah said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Truly happy." "I am," Sophia confirmed, touching the small pocket she'd had sewn into her dress where Thomas's latest letter rested close to her heart. "I found what I didn't even know to look for." By early afternoon, guests began arriving, neighboring ranchers and their families. Shopkeepers from Laramie who had come to know both Thomas and Sophia over the years. Even a delegation from the Shoshone tribe with whom Thomas had maintained friendly relations since his time with them after the war. At precisely 3 o'clock, with the June sun warm overhead and a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the cottonwoods, Sophia walked the lantern-lined path toward the flower-covered arch where Thomas and the minister waited. No formal aisle had been created instead. Guests gathered in a loose circle around the arch, creating an intimate atmosphere that suited the occasion perfectly. Thomas, dressed in a new suit that nonetheless couldn't disguise his rancher's build and weathered features, watched Sophia approach with an expression of such open adoration that several of the women present dabbed at their eyes. Gone was his usual reserve, replaced by undisguised joy as she reached his side. The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and certain in the afternoon quiet. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas's kiss was both tender and possessive, a public declaration of the private devotion he had shown her for months. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Tables groaned with food prepared by Mrs. Finch and neighboring women, while Thomas's ranch hands had constructed a dance floor beneath the cottonwoods where fiddle music soon had couples twirling under the emerging stars. Lanterns hung from tree branches created pools of golden light as dusk settled over the land. "Mrs. Garrison," Thomas said, finding her among the guests as the night deepened. "May I have this dance?" Sophia smiled at her new name, taking his offered hand. I believe you're entitled, Mr. Garrison." As they moved together beneath the lantern light, the conversations and laughter of their guests creating a joyful backdrop to the music, Thomas bent to whisper in her ear. "Happy, completely," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though I must confess, I'm looking forward to the quieter moments too." His arms tightened around her. "Got plenty of those ahead of us, whole lifetime of them." The celebration continued around them, but in that moment, they were alone in their shared certainty, a private bubble of contentment in the midst of communal joy. Later, much later, when most guests had departed and only a few remained talking quietly around the dying fire, Thomas and Sophia slipped away to the cabin. It had been transformed in their absence, with fresh flowers on every surface, and the simple bedroom made inviting with new linens Sarah's doing. Sophia suspected, recognizing her sister's romantic touch. "Different from our first meeting here," Thomas observed, looking around the cabin that now held so many memories. "When you were reading his letter and I suggested you burn it." "Best advice I ever took," Sophia replied, stepping into his embrace, "though I still expect more letters as promised." Thomas's smile held both tenderness and desire as he drew her closer. Every day, in one way or another, the years that followed proved the truth of Thomas's promise. Through seasons of plenty and hardship, through the expansion of their holdings and the growth of their family, he continued to find ways to express his devotion. Sometimes in actual written words, more often in actions that spoke louder than any penned sentiment could. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth after Sophia's mother, arrived in the spring of 1879, followed by a son, Michael, 2 years later. The children grew strong in the Wyoming air, learning to ride almost before they could walk, absorbing their father's respect for the land and their mother's appreciation for beauty in unexpected places. Sarah remained in Wyoming, eventually marrying Hank after a courtship that began the day after Sophia and Thomas's wedding. They built their own home on a parcel of land. Thomas gifted them adjoining the main ranch, creating an extended family compound that provided both independence and community. The apple trees Thomas had planted the spring before their wedding bore their first fruit, 6 years later, small but sweet apples that Elizabeth and Michael helped harvest with solemn importance. Each autumn after that brought a more abundant crop, until eventually their cellar shelves were lined with jars of applesauce and apple butter prepared for the winter months. James Harrington's grand plans for a township bearing his name never materialized. The railroad indeed bypassed his chosen location, and eventually news filtered back that he had returned to Boston after selling his land rights at a significant loss. Sophia felt a brief pang of sympathy when she heard, but no regret for the choice she had made. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1888, Thomas presented Sophia with a special gift, a bound collection of all the letters he had written her over the years, from that first one after she burned James's letter to the most recent, penned the night before. The final page contained not a letter but a promise for the future, 10 years of letters behind us, a lifetime more ahead. The best stories have no final chapter, they just keep unfolding, one day at a time. Thank you for choosing our story, Sophia. For burning that letter and allowing me to write you better ones. As they sat on the porch of their expanded home that evening, watching their children play among the now mature apple trees while the Wyoming sunset painted the sky in impossible colors, Sophia reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Thomas asked, his hand finding hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Sophia smiled, turning to the man whose steadfast love had shaped her life in ways she could never have imagined when she first arrived in the territory. "I'm thinking about promises kept," she said simply. "And letters written not just with ink, but with a life well lived." Thomas's eyes, still as blue as the prairie skies though now crinkled at the corners from years of sun and laughter, held hers with the same intensity that had first captured her heart. "Best kind of writing there is," he agreed, squeezing her hand. As night settled over the land they had tended together, stars emerging like silver punctuation marks in the vast story of the Wyoming sky, Sophia leaned against her husband's shoulder in contentment. The young woman who had once clung desperately to a single letter's empty promises had found instead a life filled with words made real through action, devotion proven through presence, and love expressed in 1,000 daily choices. It was, she reflected, a far better story than she could ever have written for herself, one that continued to unfold with each sunrise, each season, each year they shared. And all because she had read that letter one last time, and a cowboy had promised to write her better ones.